Long since, because we can sell our votes to no one, we have thrown off our cares. Those who once bestowed commands, consulships, legions, everything, now refrain and long eagerly for just two things: bread and circuses. So declared the Roman philosopher Juvenal in his Satire. In ancient Rome, the state sought to pacify the people by feeding large groups of citizens and then distracting them with entertainment, such as feeding Christians to the lions and other such sports. How much has really changed since then? Oh, we feed different folks to metaphorical lions today, but we still feed others to the lions. Comparisons are often made between the Roman Empire and the American Empire today. And it is very much an empire, geopolitically, economically, and culturally. And just as we sometimes speak of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, it is not unreasonable to speculate about whether or not, after 248 years, the American empire finds itself in a similar stage of decline. It seems that the principalities and powers of modern times still offer bread and circuses to distract the masses, so that people don't notice their failure to offer peace, order, and good government, not to mention justice. With just 4.23% of the world's population, the United States enjoys 25.95% of the world's gross domestic product. Yet powerful forces in that country have managed to convince many of its citizens that they, and the country itself, are hard done by. Victims of other countries who take advantage of them, such as Canada with its nasty trade surplus, notwithstanding clear evidence to the contrary. Now, in fairness, America's disproportionate share of the world's income and wealth is far from equitably shared. So it's no surprise that some Americans are unaware of the disparity. Indeed, the country's wealth today is as unevenly distributed as the wealth of France on the eve of the French Revolution. Slightly more so, it seems. But the propaganda of the country's billionaires, which is to say its oligarchs, if we want to use universal terminology that we use for other countries, its oligarchs have convinced a majority of the country's voters that the problem is external. Somehow they have come to believe that foreign nations and so-called illegal immigrants are the reason people are falling behind, not the hoarding and wealth of the oligarchs. There's nothing like an external enemy to rally a people, save perhaps for demonized minorities within. And it is bread and circuses that have led the American electorate down the road of misinformation, disinformation, and outright ignorance. Donald Trump's initial rise to power 8 years ago and his resurrection from the political graveyard this year is an illustration of the power of bread and circuses. That is, meager material incentives and entertaining spectacles to lead large numbers of people down the proverbial garden path. Americans have been distracted into subverting their own best interests, and I'm sorry to report that public opinion polls suggest that Canadians are not as far behind as we might like to think. Greed and titillation both have powerful appetites. In his commentary on Juvenal's satire, Michael Macroney, who's something of a polymath, writes that Juvenal points the finger at present-day apathy and cynicism, Since its applause has lost its power over people of ambition, the public has stopped taking its civic responsibilities seriously. Power has turned into a vicious, competitive game that aspiring persons play, and the people just sit back and watch them rise and fall, still applauding today's victor and booing today's victim, but now in vain. Society has become amoral and irrational, and the people cowardly and lazy. All they ask for is bread and circuses, a full belly, and interesting shows. Think reality television in terms of the modern world. Satisfying the people's appetite for food, and we might add cheap consumer goods, along with trivial distractions, is no less effective today than it was in ancient Rome. In fact, it may be more powerful because of the exponential power of the electronic media to convey messages far and wide. But in Western democracies with capitalist economies, it is not so much governments as it is powerful private interests, corporations that rival governments in real power, and the oligarchs who own them, that seek to control people's behavior with the present-day equivalent of bread and circuses. Governments have come to be targeted as enemies within, while unaccountable corporations distract us from their activities, which is easier than ever when such corporations control not only the so-called mainstream media, but also the alternative media and social media platforms. They're rather like drug dealers if you stop to think about it. They control access to whatever allows them to maintain the degree of power and the lack of accountability that they enjoy. And it doesn't matter whether it's something for good, let's say the mainstream media. I know some of you may not feel that way about it. Or something for ill, such as, let's say, the alternative media, which you would think would be largely in the hands of people who are opposed to the power of both state and corporation. But curiously, that's not the case. The ownership is the same for both. And social media platforms, well, it turns out you can just buy one and do with it what you will, change the algorithms so that your post always appears first in everyone's feed, whether or not they actually like you or even respect you. Aldous Huxley echoed Juvenal's Satire in his Brave New World Revisited, which was published when television was still young. In fact, I'm not sure my family owned a television in 1958, but if they did, it was a brand new set, and it hadn't been in the living room for long. It would be interesting to know what Huxley might have said today. But in 1958, he already saw a trend developing in mass communications in which the unreal and the irrelevant were displacing both the true and the false in public discourse. Although I think it's fair to argue that the unreal and irrelevant are, in fact, just variations of falsehood. But Huxley predicted that we were vulnerable less to false news than actually to irrelevant news, to being distracted by things that simply don't matter. Huxley had postulated that there were two kinds of propaganda. Rational propaganda, in favor of action that is consonant with the enlightened self-interest of those who make it and those to whom it is addressed, and non-rational propaganda that is not consonant with anybody's enlightened self-interest, but is dictated by and appeals to passion. In other words, the political commercial. The first kind of propaganda, if it's fair to even call it propaganda, relies on logical arguments based on the available evidence. It's the propaganda that comes from Manitoba Hydro when they tell you to call before you dig. That's actually good advice. In fact, it's not harmful at all. It's positive. It's helpful to us. Or, for that matter, the advice from the Department of Health to consider vaccination against the most treacherous diseases. And then there is the non-rational propaganda, which appeals to the passion, the political commercial that reminds us of dangerous killers in our midst, even though they are few and far between. But those who promote those ads know that it will stir up fear in the general population, leading them to demand solutions to problems that they may or may not actually face. The kind of propaganda that appeals to the passions offers false, garbled, or incomplete evidence, avoids logical argument, and seeks to influence its victims by the mere repetition of catchwords, by the furious denunciation of foreign and domestic scapegoats, and by cunningly associating the lowest passions with the highest ideals, often conflating these passions with religion and patriotism. Does this sound remotely familiar to you? This is an almost perfect description of the environment we have been living in for nearly a decade, perhaps longer, depending on how subtle a message of this sort you're responsive to. Huxley offers a near-perfect description of the far right wherever it's found, including the misnamed Make America Great movement, a term that is itself a deception. Its acronym, MAGA, is to be preferred if only because it doesn't repeat the falsehood of the name. It's a phenomenon that has been present in America for generations, at least as far back as the aptly named Know Nothing movement, a movement that hadn't yet discovered the power of propaganda. And it has resurfaced regularly, albeit under different names, including America First and McCarthyism, and among different groups, from the John Birch Society to the Dixiecrats. Given its recent political success under the chaotic leadership of the president-elect, it would be fair to call it Trumpism, although I'm hesitant to stroke his fragile ego with the word. The power to respond to reason and truth exists in all of us, affirmed Huxley. But so, unfortunately, does the tendency to respond to unreason and falsehood, particularly in those cases where falsehood evokes some enjoyable emotion, or where the appeal to unreason strikes some answering chord in the primitive, subhuman depths of our being. And so even liberals can be drawn towards falsehoods that somehow appeal to their emotions. Huxley was persuaded that it was easier to affirm reason and truth in the fields of science and technology, although the resurgence of belief in creationism and other anti-scientific movements, not to mention the assortment of conspiracy theories and magical feeling that exists today, make me wonder if this is necessarily true in a society where so many are ignorant about the findings of science, let alone its methods, many willfully so. But even if we concede this point to Huxley, he acknowledged that it is much more difficult in the fields of politics and religion and ethics, where ideology naturally exerts a strong influence over people's views. Mass communication, in a word, is neither good nor bad, he asserted. It is simply a force, And like any other force, it can be used for good or ill. Used in one way, the press, radio, and cinema are indispensable to the survival of democracy. Used in another way, they are among the most powerful weapons in a dictator's armory. Our society has allowed the media to gravitate in the direction of enabling the latter, authoritarian sentiments. Much more closer to our time, Neil Postman also reflected upon the thoughts of Juvenal and the teachings of Aldous Huxley. Postman said that when a population becomes distracted by trivia, when cultural life is redefined as a perpetual round of entertainments, when serious public conversation becomes a form of baby talk, when, in short, people become an audience and their public business a vaudeville act, then a nation finds itself at risk. Culture death, he says, is a clear possibility. We live in that era in many ways, where triviality has come to dominate the media that we all consume. Let's face it, reality TV is enjoyable. Who doesn't want to watch Naked and Afraid, even if they blur part of the image on the screen? We want to see people struggle in the wilderness to survive for, what is it, a month, a week, however long it is. We call it reality TV, but it really isn't. It's not the reality of most people. Even The Apprentice, with its catchphrase, "You're fired," was all contrived. If they had wanted to secure a real serious business person to host that show, well, that person wouldn't have been available because they'd have been too busy living real lives. Postman observes that throughout history, different cities have been representative of the spirit of a nation or culture as a whole. He cites Boston, New York, and Chicago as three American examples, although I would have added San Francisco to his list. Here in Canada, Toronto and Montreal have long vied to be the city in our nation's consciousness. And there was a period when Winnipeg was even a contender, although Calgary and Vancouver may be thought to top the list today. 2 decades ago, Postman's nominee for the city that best represents the American character was Las Vegas, which is a city devoted to the idea of entertainment, and as such proclaims the spirit of culture in which all public discourse increasingly takes the form of public entertainment. Since Canada is increasingly dominated by the United States in the media realm, I dare say that Postman's pick may well represent the character not just of the country to the south, but of the whole continent, at least the English-speaking part of it. In this regard, at least, Canada is something of a sideshow in the larger circus of North American life. Our politics, religion, news, athletics, education, and commerce have been transformed into congenial adjuncts of show business, largely without protest or even much popular notice. The result, says Postman, is that we are a people on the verge of amusing ourselves to death. But 8 years ago, and reinforced this year, our entertainments are less amusing than we once imagined where it might be. Postman challenges us to draw the line between politics and entertainment, even though he suggests that television has all but annihilated it. Many of you have asked me in recent weeks what we can do to survive the next 4 years. Let's hope it's only 4. First of all, let us acknowledge that it has taken 2 generations to create the current mess throughout the democratic countries of the world. And it's going to take 2 generations to dig ourselves out of it. So the time to start is now. We need to support responsible media. That means subscribing to responsible newspapers and magazines again, offering our support to public broadcasting, and remaining engaged on social media even when it's difficult. This includes supporting local media cooperatives and campus radio stations. We have at least 3 such media outlets here in Winnipeg, and they are worthy of our support. It means returning to the old discipline of writing letters to the editor and offering feedback to media outlets about their coverage, even outlets like the CBC, who have made it increasingly difficult to do so by closing their comments online. We need to flood the media and the offices of politicians with words of sanity, words of reason, words of conscience in an environment where the frivolous and the trivial, I almost coined a new word there, the trivial, where they dominate. Each of us might consider a news diet. Budget the amount of time we're willing to be distracted and demoralized by the infotainment industry in favor of focusing on reliable news sources and ignoring the distractors who seem mostly interested in selling pharmaceuticals, payday loans, and reverse mortgages. No, you really don't need to subscribe to generic Viagra online, and you don't need to support the advertisers or the broadcast media that just inflict those advertisements on us constantly. We need to stay engaged with friends and family to ensure that they are hearing alternative points of view to the ones they are being fed by the media and by their bubbles online. Of course, some relations are beyond repair. I'm talking about the individuals who may still be worth the effort. We need to resist the silencing and self-defeating belief that politics and religion are not fit subjects for polite company. Indeed, we may need to redraw the line between mere politeness and genuine civility. The truth of the matter is that if our friends and family don't care to hear our political viewpoints, don't care to hear our religious values, they're actually not interested in who we are. We need to take the economy back from the unaccountable by supporting local businesses over franchises, real entrepreneurs over corporations, labor unions over ideologically captive chambers of commerce. We need to support groups that are challenging the negative narratives coming from the right, including this church and other community organizations, while offering reasoned criticism even of the politicians, public figures, and organizations we do support, who sometimes are tempted to give way to the pressure of others. If we don't like the circus, then we need to seize the concessions, rescue the captives, confront the performers, and stop feeding the clowns. Please join in hymn number 300 with heart and mind.